Welcome back to the Rebel Podcast. We are a podcast with the Fight, Laugh, Feast Network and a ministry of the Ezra Institute. This podcast is for cultural engagement, and the purpose here is to help equip you with a Christian worldview so that you can equip the culture. And we're in this new series called How to Win the World. And today I'm joined by a very special guest. It's my first time actually ever talking with Dr. Joe Rigney. So Dr. Joe Rigney, welcome to the Rebel Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Nate.
Yeah, it's awesome. For any of our listeners who don't know, Dr. Joe Rigney serves as the Fellow of Theology at New St. Andrews College in Moscow. He's authored a bunch of books. Ones that I've read include The Things of Earth, Live Like a Narnian. His new book is Leadership and Emotional Sabotage. You'll see a lot of his stuff on Canon Plus. You have three sons, I believe. Is that? Mm-hmm. And your wife's name is Jenny, and you guys just recently moved to Moscow, Idaho. How are you enjoying the cold?
Well, we came from Minnesota, so this has actually been warmer. So
there you go. There you go. You moved a little bit south, did you?
Well, actually, I think it's farther north, but Minnesota is just colder. So
there you go.
We had a much milder winter compared to usual.
Fair enough. I know you're a big baseball fan. I've heard you talk about baseball quite a bit in The Things of Earth. I remember you talking about baseball being one of the things that reminds us that God loves us. But we just had the Edmonton Oilers just made it to the Stanley Cup playoffs. I mean, Minnesota, it's a hockey town. Are you a hockey fan at all?
No, not in the. I mean, like the extent of my hockey fandom is watching Miracle.
Fair enough.
The Herb Brooks. That's it.
Fair enough. Well, you can be forgiven for that. But what we were hoping to talk about today in terms of kind of under the umbrella of this new series, How to Win the World, we're kind of talking about some key doctrines or some key things, practices that Christians have maybe lost, maybe that we haven't been as faithful in over the last several decades, that if we can recapture them, it's going to help us in terms of expanding the kingdom of God, help win the world as we're called to do as Christians. So I want to talk mostly about your new book, Leadership and Emotional Sabotage, and talk a little bit about courageous leadership. So I guess my first question would just be like, what is it that kind of compelled you to write this book? When I read it, I know it's a recent book, but when I read it, the first thing I thought was, I wish this book had been written and in every pastor's hands prior to 2020 and the whole COVID pandemic. But tell me a little bit about what made the ideas come to your mind and made you want to write the book.
Yeah, it's kind of a coming together of a number of different threads. One, which I talk about in the book especially, is Edwin Friedman's work on leadership. And so he wrote a book in the 90s called Failure of Nerve, which was very influential on me about 10 to 15 years ago. And so that's kind of one stream feeding into it. And I'd say one of the things I've been doing with Friedman for a long time is he needs to be translated. His categories, his that sort of stuff is all psychology, evolutionary, those sort of things. And so his categories have to be translated into biblical ones. So I've been doing that in classes. I've been doing that in my own ministry, talking to people. So that's kind of one. The world sort of between 2014 and 2020-ish kind of conspired to kind of prove Friedman's point. And so his insights became more and more relevant as he talked about failures of nerve, reactive environments, anxious systems, and so forth. So that's one sort of stream. The other, though, was kind of through that. Really, I had over the last, 3 or 4 years, settled in on sober-mindedness as sort of an underappreciated virtue in the modern world. It's one that shows up in all of the sort of leadership lists in the New Testament. You know, what does an elder need to be? Sober-minded is going to be in there. What do older men need to be? Sober-minded. But it was one that I'd never really unpacked or really thought much about. And as we, saw sort of in American society or Canadian society, Western society in general, as passions began to dominate our culture, and as they sort of surged through homes and churches and the wider culture, sober-mindedness became a much more central virtue. We see why it's so important that we not be governed, steered, by our passions. And so that was another kind of piece. And so there was the kind of the coming together of those two items that kind of led to do this book.
That's awesome. The I saw a lot of convergence. I mean, I had read The Things of Earth years ago. I remember taking it on vacation with me one year, and as I'm sitting, in Florida on the beach, with my little first baby daughter in front of me, and just thinking like, this is as good as life gets. And then I open up your book, Things of Earth, and it was just such a perfect. I remember that book kind of got a special place in my heart because I was reading it at such a time when there's a lot of great things that I was enjoying in life, starting a family and newly married and all that kind of stuff. And it honestly, that book kind of shook me just in terms of I'd grown up in a lot of the pietistic, what came out of the Young, Restless, and Reformed, and kind of jumping into Christian hedonism and all that kind of stuff. And it's fantastic. But you talk really, really at length about the tension that creates in terms of, understanding, the connection between God's glory and our satisfaction, but then, are we supposed to enjoy everything else? And so I've been tracking you for a while, and interestingly, what kind of put you back on my radar, and then I started reading, some of the things that I'd missed in between, was when you're on Man Rampant and you talked about the sin of empathy. And again, that was another thing that it just kind of shook me, because it was like, I mean, not unlike Doug to have a very provocative title there for you, but I'm like, what do you mean sin of empathy? So it seems like these were concepts that were already floating around in your head around that time, because the idea of the sin of empathy really works well with a lot of what you're talking about in terms of emotional sabotage in the book. So why don't you start by maybe defining what you mean by, what is the sin of empathy? Is all empathy a sin? What do you mean by that? And then I'll kind of use that to launch into some of the stuff in the book.
Yeah, sure. So the funny thing is everybody wants to blame Doug for that title. That was my title. That was they invited me. So what do you want to talk about? I said, let's talk about the sin of empathy. Partly because Doug and I had a shared affinity for Friedman. And Friedman is the one who identifies empathy as a power tool in the hands of the sensitive. That in the modern world, it's a tool of hijacking, and so he was the one who was saying this is actually the key issue that leaders have to deal with, is how do you deal with the tendency to want to accommodate or coddle the most reactive and immature members of a community, and the way that social pressure will be leveraged in order to make sure that happens. And so, that's the provocative title. Does it mean all empathy is bad? Does it mean all compassion is bad? Of course not. In fact, like one of the key reasons to emphasize this is that compassion is such a great virtue. It's a biblical virtue, but it can be like all passions. Compassion can be excessive. It can become untethered. And so what may help people sometimes is to think in the same way that anger can either be righteous anger or unrighteous anger, depending on its object and depending on its intensity, or fear could be virtuous or not, holy or unholy. Desire can be unholy and holy. The same thing is true of the passion of pity, or what you might call compassion or empathy. So don't get stuck on the word, but I would say in the modern world, empathy is the term it runs under, because it's regarded often, it's set up as an improvement upon the old virtue of sympathy or compassion. Sympathy and compassion were fine, but empathy is an improvement. It's sort of compassion 2.0. Well, what makes it better? Well, what makes it better is that you jump in, you go in all whole hog, both feet, and you you stay out of judgment. There's no you validate all. It's all validation. So if someone's hurting, you just check your discernment kind of at the door. And nobody, I say nobody. There are people who actually argue that's exactly what makes it good. But most of us don't think of it that way. But it's amazing how easily we can slide into that under the right circumstances, where if someone's drowned, the image that we've used a number of times is if someone's drowning, apathy, which is what a lot of people are worried about, apathy stands on the side and doesn't care, doesn't jump in, isn't going to do anything to help. Compassion would say, hey, let's grab onto one side of this. I'm going to grab a branch and I'm going to reach in there and I'm going to, get you by the hand, and I'm going to be tethered to the side and I'm tethered to you and I'm going to help pull you out, because I'm I want to help. I'm moved by your suffering. I'm going to help you. Empathy says, I'm just going to jump in and drown with you. And so psychologically, you've got terms like fusion and enmeshment and these other sort of terms that show up in the psychological literature. But it's like, what's the Bible terms for this? And I think pity or sympathy would be the biblical term, and it could go wrong. And I think when it does, it's called, we call it empathy in the modern world.
So you kind of take that same theme, that idea of sort of being steered by other people's stations, other people's emotions. You started out by talking about just how a lot of this came from your biblical study of the virtue of sober-mindedness. And in the book, you describe sober-mindedness as sort of steering away from two different things: A, getting drunk on your own passions, your own emotions, and then also getting drunk on other people's emotions, which I actually think is the more modern, subtle thing that a lot of leaders. It was actually kind of a virtue for you to be moved to make decisions and all that kind of stuff based on other people's passions. So, as you have this concern about leadership and you're trying to put Friedman in a sort of a biblical language and context, where were some areas where you see Christian leaders? We'll talk maybe pastors. You could talk about fathers within the home. Getting drunk on other people's passions. What does that look like maybe in the home? What does that look like in the church? What does that look like in the culture?
Yeah, so that language of drunk is, picking up on that sober-mindedness. And the idea is that just in the same way that when you have excessive amounts of alcohol, your judgment's impaired, you can't see clearly, you make poor decisions. So that's that kind of same kind of moral and physical impairment can happen by more substances than just alcohol, one of which is our passions. So our own passions, we can be blinded by anger or overwhelmed by fear and paralyzed and things like that. And but because we're social creatures, other people's emotions are really powerful and they can sweep us off our feet. So getting drunk on other people's passions is when their passions are in our driver's seat. So so if you start in the home, one place that this can show up, I think, is under the guise of servant leadership as a model for a husband's headship, which in and of itself is a fine phrase. You can see where it would come from in the scriptures: lead like Jesus. But where it would get hijacked would be when it would become sort of the "if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy" school of husbanding. Okay, happy wife, happy life, where the implicit expectation, maybe it's explicit once you're saying happy wife, happy life. What you're saying is the effect is whatever she wants, do it, and that's the highest value is sort of peace at all costs. And so ostensibly the husband's the head, say if you're operating in a biblical framework, but functionally that's not the case because her unhappiness still steers the home. So that would be one place that it could show up in a home setting. In a church setting, I think over the last 10 plus years, you saw a number of different places where you'd have real problems that needed to be addressed, usually around a cluster of issues that were in the wider culture, but also historically have been issues in the church. So whether it's issues of race and ethnicity, whether it's issues of manhood and womanhood, or whether it's issues usually tied to that of abuse, all of which, again, there are real issues to be addressed. There are real sins involved at various times, things that need to be acknowledged, things that need to be corrected, need to be repented of, and solutions need to be offered. All of that's real. But what happened was, in our zeal, those problems came to dominate so much that they kind of created a tunnel vision where Christians got steered by a combination of compassion on the one hand for victims, and what some people discovered was once real compassion for real victims was offered, some people figured out that they could flop and they could get the same attention and they could get the same power. And so you had all of a sudden through, in the wider culture, you had phenomenon of language inflation, concept creep, where these categories like trauma and abuse, which historically had very particular meanings and they were unusual. They were meant to be, this isn't normal sin, this isn't normal stuff, this is turn it up to 11 sort of sin. And those concepts got enlarged, expanded, and applied to normal stuff. And so and with much success, because as soon as the abuse accusation gets lodged, or I've been traumatized, and you think about in the culture the phenomenon of microaggressions and safe spaces and trigger warnings and these sort of things, were all that kind of attempt to coddle and cater to the sensitive, which just created more sensitivity. Then it became a race to see who could become the most sensitive, who could be the biggest victim. And so that was, and I think it's important to stress this, because that's ideologically, there's been a lot of good work done identifying sort of the ideological framework in play, the cultural Marxism or critical theory, and the various kinds of critical theory that were employed. And the ideological stuff's important, but oftentimes the ideological stuff was in service of these more these emotional dynamics. And so you could have people who rejected intellectually that framework because they're Christians, and yet were operating according to that emotional framework. So they rejected, so they could, on paper, if you put them a statement saying, do you believe that all conflict or all whatever is an oppressed framework? Do you agree with the critical theorists on all these issues? And they'd pass the test as a Christian. And yet the dynamics underneath were still infiltrating, so that the reactivity, the passions would rage, and it would either be compassion for victims, real or alleged, or fear of being labeled, because if you don't do what happens, you're going to be called names. So this is one of the things in the book I talk about, is the way that the world will frequently slap labels on Christians, because the labels become steering wheels. Because Christians will go to great lengths in order to avoid negative reputation. All people will at some level, but Christians in particular, because of Christ's command, have a good reputation with outsiders, should be salt and light. These kind of things became steering wheels. And so whether it's compassion for victims or fear of man, fear of being labeled, fear of accusation and slander, those became steering wheels for people who could still, at some level, honestly sign whatever documents need to be signed at the ideological level.
Right. And so it sort of allowed this cognitive dissonance in the church and the church leaders and Christians' minds in general, where they could, as you said, they can condemn all the right things and affirm all the right things, and yet they're operating emotionally in the same way as everybody else in the world, because there's this disconnect between their theology and the emotional responses that they have to the things going on, which is just an interesting, cognitive dissonance seems to be one of those things that just seems to have evaporated in our culture these days. Everybody seems completely fine with contradictions.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. No, yeah. Well, it also demonstrates, I think one of the values of it is, it gives you categories for the way that people can be self-deceived, or whole communities can be self-deceived, because what's happening is the intensity of the passions is blinding. Right, that's the drunkenness idea, is that like you don't always know that you're doing it, but you can usually run some tests. There's some diagnostic things you can do to test, how much are my passions running my behavior? Because the passions in themselves are good. So I don't, sometimes we can give the impression that they're bad, but they're not. That's how you stay alive. They are the source. So when they're stewarded well, they become virtues. That desire, when you see somebody hurting and your instinct is to join them in that sorrow, and then to want to relieve that sorrow in some way, if you were to habitually do that and aim it at their ultimate good, well, that's a virtue. That's compassion. So passions are good in that sense, but they need to be governed and stewarded by what is true and what is good. And so you want God over your mind and your mind over your passions. That's how we're meant to be ordered. So they are good things, and yet they're also potent. And so when we're led by our passions, the Bible warns us over and over and over again about this problem of the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul, or the desires of the flesh. Don't be conformed to the passions of the flesh. That kind of language, you're led astray by your desires. That sort of language runs all through the New Testament, because it is a real danger, and you can test whether yours are being steered by your reactions to others.
So just press in on that a little bit. What are indicators that you are being steered by other people's emotions? What are some things so we have some listeners who are listening to all this and they're going, okay, like I wonder, am I leading my wife, in a faithful, God honoring way? Am I leading my church? Am I the leader I think I am, or am I being emotionally steered? It's easy for us to identify in examples. It's sometimes hard to identify in ourselves. So, what are some indicators that we would be getting steered by other people's passions?
Yeah, so I think in a taking a church setting, if there were certain topics, say among your elder team, that were off limits, and we all kind of have this, so you can all of a sudden start running scenarios. Are there certain things that you could say that you know intuitively? You immediately think about it and you go, if I said that, this would go off. And it's something true. It doesn't have to be something false. It shouldn't, so false things could provoke a reaction. But here's a true thing that if I said it, would be a really big deal. Okay, that's usually a sign that what there is like, I know this is true here, but at this lower level, I know that truth would land badly. And then you have to ask yourself, okay, so am I avoiding that topic because I know that it will be a problem? Well, then what you've done is you've said that the reaction you'll get is so uncomfortable to you that you'll avoid it. And people, again, human beings are really intuitive about this kind of stuff. So, families can operate this way, churches can operate this way, societies can operate this way, where people figure out that there's a lever there, and the threat of the blow up, the threat of the emotion coursing through the system is sufficient to make a lot of people just kind of back down. Or oftentimes this happens at one step removed. And so you've got, on the one hand, here's a person here's the reactive person, but the people that are actually going to be steering you are soft-hearted people who are trying to keep the peace. They don't want it to blow up. And so if you say it, they're gonna correct you because they're out of sort of a zeal to guard this hurting person. And some of it comes from like failing to distinguish between things like distress and harm. Like there's a real simple kind of like causing distress is not always sinful. There's times when distress is what's needed. But harm is something, we don't want to cause harm, but we conflate those. And so as a result, in the name of preventing harm, we'll avoid all distress, which is a recipe for superficial peace with all sorts of churning passions underneath the surface, ready to erupt when somebody lights a match.
So just on a really practical level, there's other places I want to go, but just kind of responding to that, there are areas where you're now in Moscow and you're part of the CREC, and there's baptismal, agreement there, and things like that. So I guess, what are some of we're all looking for unity in the midst of diversity, right? In the good sense. But what we're not looking for is a sort of big tent unity where, we don't talk about certain things. We can't sharpen one another. We can't challenge one another. And we start to allow things in that are actually of primary concern. So what are some ways, like, just as I hear you saying that, okay, so there's topics that would cause some consternation and you avoid those things. Okay, so now that's obviously not something that good leadership should do. But how do you kind of tell the difference between unity in the midst of a diversity in a good way that we're going for versus, avoiding things and not moving in a particular direction for fear of offense?
Yeah, so some of this is the question of kind of theological triage. What issues rise to certain levels, and that's often not merely it's not a static thing. So there are certain things that are always sort of first order issues, perennial gospel issues. Is Christ who he says he was, that kind of thing. But oftentimes our debates are more about the coalition. When you're talking about the unity, it's what kind of unity can we have in a congregation, across congregations, in a denomination, and then from denominations outward. And that's where distinguishing between first order issues, which are necessary for the life of the church. If you don't have these doctrines buttoned down, if you don't affirm them, love them, celebrate them, then you don't have a church at all. So there's that sort of issue. Most of our debates on this question are about what's second tier and what's third tier. What the difference in second, third tier would be second tier issues are necessary for the health of the church. These are things where you're alive, you're a real Christian, but you're a sick Christian if you get this wrong. And then third tier are necessary for like the practice of the church. Just functionally, you might have different churches that could operate in different ways based on wisdom, and you're going to have separate churches for that. And so once you have that category of health, then you can also distinguish. Health's a sliding spectrum. You got stage 4 cancer on the one end, and you've got a mild cold on the other. So and sometimes there's reasons in which you would say, in order to prevent stage 4 cancer from spreading, or here's a lethal disease that's running rampant. In order to do that, we need to unite together with some people who we think have colds. Right. So we think, in other words, we think that they're mistaken on this issue. But for the sake of, this is what's kind of the together for the gospel, or that issue is meant to sort of say like, hey, yep, we disagree, and we know what we're doing. I think the other thing that's in play in the modern context about this question is most of our big fights, most of the big cultural battles are over anthropology. That's the kind of broad category of doctrine that we're dealing with or trying to deal with in the present era. You think early church was dealing with Trinity, Christology, Reformation's dealing with doctrine of salvation and biblical authority. Biblical authority kind of runs through all of these, but now we're dealing with what is man? What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? These sort of social order, these are anthropology questions, which means that certain questions kind of get downgraded in significance that would have been when everybody was united on basic moral order. Right, that there's a law, there's God is God, there's a law, and we're in submission to Him. In that kind of context, in a Christendom context, say debates over baptism are pretty significant, because you're working your way towards greater and greater unity, and so the divisions are over that kind of baptismal question. In a society like ours, the ruins of Christendom, where everything's breaking apart, the reason that baptismal debate has kind of lessened is because other ones have become more substantial. How do you respond to the widespread cultural chaos? How do you respond to the sexual revolution? And so in some ways, what ends up happening is people find I've got more in common with someone of a different persuasion on baptism, because we're both united in recognizing that this is how we need to respond to the cultural insanity. And so that this kind of shakes up. So our denominational lines get all scrambled because that's really what's in play. And I think the key thing to bring it back to leadership is, if you know what you're doing, that's a perfectly reasonable decision to make, to say, you know what, given where we're at, we Baptists and Presbyterians have more in common. And so we know we disagree. We can cheerfully do it. It's not end of the world. It's in a certain triage bucket. And because of that, then we're going to be on the same page in relation to other issues. That's a perfectly reasonable way of approaching it. If you do it, again, in a sober-minded, clear-eyed, we know what we're doing. We're not just doing lowest common denominator. The only doctrines that matter are first-tier issues. That's not true, because cancer eventually does kill you. And so allowing, say, feminism into the church is a recipe for, over time, the destruction of that church. And so resisting that is a really important issue. It's not, even though you might say, yeah, the person I'm arguing with is a Christian, they'll go to heaven when they die. The teaching that they're offering isn't, or the instincts that they're inculcating aren't. And so that we're going to resist that strenuously. We're going to purify the church from its influence. We're doing that in order so that it doesn't get worse.
Yeah, that's really good. That's helpful. I kind of want to come back. You were just talking about cultural chaos, and it kind of flows from this conversation, because we're talking about faithful churches, maybe of slightly different tertiary issues coming together to fight what's going on in the culture. So in that culture of chaos, in the book, you quoted Shakespeare to kind of talk about the chaos in the culture being a crisis of degree. I thought this was just such a helpful category, such helpful language to kind of put your finger on the chaos in the world. We've all heard Doug talk about it's Christ or chaos, but I just found the whole crisis of degree and quoting Shakespeare there really, really helpful. So do you want to go through that? What is a crisis of degree, and what does it mean? How is our culture sick in that way?
Yeah, so degree is basically a Shakespearean term for social order, and it has to do with basically ordered relationships. So relationships among people who aren't the same. So husband wife would be an example of a degree relationship. Parent child would be, pastor congregant would be, business employer employee, magistrate citizen. Societies are all filled with these relationships of difference. And the thing is that there's different responsibilities, different expectations, different duties, and yet they need to be united in some way. And so Shakespeare sort of has this idea that within a given society, degree with a capital D is sort of that invisible organizing principle that allows things to function properly. And so he uses, and so I pick up and elaborate on this, the sort of gravity. Now, he doesn't call it gravity, but he's basically the way the sun causes the planets to orbit properly. That's how degree works. It's invisible. You can't point at it, but you can see its effects everywhere. You can see the planets orbiting properly. And so in the social, basically the natural world in this case is an image of the social world, where an ideal situation, you have God at the center. He's the sun, and he causes the planets to orbit properly. And then the planets are the different spheres of society, each of which has a representative head, which causes the moons, let's call them moons, the other members to orbit properly as well. And so when the sun's working and gravity's thick and it's all good, all the planets orbit properly and it's good. Now it's, fallen world, it's never going to be perfect, but it can be better or worse. When degree is shaked, that's Shakespeare's term, when degree is covered over, concealed, broken, when it becomes untuned, uses a musical image, then discord, chaos just follows. Everything chokes, because all of a sudden everything's just crashing into each other. So the different spheres of society don't operate the way they ought. The different members of society are at war, and it leads to kind of you get proliferation of rivalries, envies. So because there's no clear order, there's no sort of honor your parents principle, there's no fifth commandment principle operative. It's just rivalries. And then those rivalries eventually lead to conflicts and scapegoating, where people are blaming other people for all the problems. And then you can, at the end of it, you get widespread violence and it gets really ugly. But before then, it's just it is mass chaos as people fight to kind of reassert degree with themselves at the top. And so for the Christian, it's how God made an ordered world. How do we seek to, by the grace of God, bring our various areas, home, church, world, into proper orbit? How do we ground ourselves in the truth of who God is, personally? So it starts with, the well-ordered soul is sort of the first. This is why the sober-mindedness thing becomes important. You can't export it to institutions if you don't have it at all. And so you got to have sober-minded leaders, and then they can steady the ship in their various spheres.
That's awesome. And that actually starts the transition that I'd really like to get to, which is sort of that. So you saw you using Shakespeare, you kind of, I think, very rightly and very wisely kind of put your finger on a way of describing what's wrong with the world. The world, gravity is pulling apart. Degree has been kind of shattered. You have everybody sort of vying for that central piece of the ordered universe. And you can see how all of the CRT and cultural Marxism, all of this stuff plays into it, because it's all trying to reorder what are the relationships between these various pieces of society. And I think it's, number one, really helpful for Christians just to be completely committed to the reality that God's kingdom is not after the sort of egalitarian equality that the world is. And I think we need to start there and just say that's not the world that God created. God created a world with lots of diversity, lots of hierarchy, lots of structure, and we're supposed to love what God loves, and this is how He made it. But as you see all that, and I thought that was really, really helpful. The book is about leadership. So you believe that sober-minded leaders are actually the cure to this crisis of degree. So tell us, and you started getting there as you were talking about like kind of the spheres and working outward, start with yourself. But I just love to give you a couple minutes to just, okay, why is it that sober-minded leaders are the cure to cultural chaos? How is it that that leaders are going to save the world?
Yeah. So at some level, what I would say that if you were to speak real precisely, it would be something like the way that God is going to reorder things is by means of sober-minded leaders. So this is, we want to say it's God's action. How does he do it? Well, he saves people. And one of the things he does, he gives them his Holy Spirit. And then they have gravity in fearing the Lord. That gives, where's the ultimate source of gravity? And it's the glory of God, and it's the fear of the Lord, which is responding to the glory of God and gives us a gravity. And it's not just a gravity in the somber, dour sense. It's gravity and gladness. So gravity and gladness is what the individual leader needs. There's a weightiness there. He's competent. He's confident. He knows what he's about. He has a clear vision for what the household should work, or how the institution should work. And so he knows what he's for, and he's got gravity, and he's rejoicing in all of God's kindness, and he's grateful and full of life. And then the combo of that then means he leads by his gravity. His presence and his words and his deeds help to reorient the institutions of which he's a part. So his family, his church, and so forth. And it works outward from that. So this is why, the right worship of God is essential. We worship the Lord in order to be filled up, in order to be grounded, in order to have some gravity. And then the first place it should show up is in your home and your church community. It sort of spills the banks, and it's reorienting households, reorienting churches. And then from that, it begins to reorder communities and neighborhoods. And we'll see how, and then the Lord decides where the banks are, right? How far was this spread? So that's the sort of the picture. And on the egalitarian thing, this is somewhat implicit, and it's a place of that I don't spend a lot of time in the book. I don't know if I, other than in the household chapter, maybe I mention it, is, the book is written for leaders, which means it's first and foremost written for men. So there is an implicit sort of patriarchal assumption in the book. At one point I say, this is one thing I do pretty regularly when I go speak places. I'll say, does the Bible teach that husbands should be the head of their home? And in a lot of conservative churches, people will start nodding their heads. And then I'll say, you're absolutely wrong. It doesn't. And they'll kind of look at you and say, what? And you say, no, the Bible teaches that the husband is the head of the home, right? It's an indicative statement, not an imperative statement. It's a fact. The husband is. Okay, that's the reality. The question is he a faithful husband? Is he a faithful head or an unfaithful one? So that's sort of a baseline assumption, and that starts in the home, but it's also why God cuts with the grain of the world he made. He says, okay, if that's the way I made the world, then in the church, pastors need to be men. But it also then is normative. It's not exclusive in the same way, because those relationships, once you get outside the home and the church, are a little more fluid, and it's less clear. But the normative assumption is that you're going to have men in positions of leadership out there. Having said that, the book is relevant for women, because women too need to be sober-minded, right? They need to have well-ordered souls. They need to have composed, right? The gentle and quiet spirit that Peter commends isn't mainly about a personality trait. He's not saying God likes wallflowers and he wants you to be shy, right? No, what he's commending is the gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is precious, is a well-composed soul. She's not afraid of things that are frightening. So fear doesn't run her life. When her husband comes home and says, honey, we're leaving and we're going where God's going to take us. And then she says, well, where is that? And he says, I don't know. That's terrifying for Sarah when Abraham does that. And yet she doesn't fear anything that's frightening. She hopes in God. Okay, I'm going to trust God. I'm going to trust you, and I'll follow. She's got a well-composed soul. And so women need it just in the same way. But men have a particular responsibility by God's assignment in the way that he's made the world, so that masculine gravity, stability, steadfastness, and sober-mindedness anchors homes, churches, communities. And then women fall in line, join up. They can wreck things. Women can make a big mess of stuff, just like men can. But there's a particular, and the first place is on men.
Yeah, that's so good. I love the application for women as well, because obviously I read the book and I've read a lot of your stuff, and a lot that's coming out of Canon Plus and Aaron Renn and all these things. So you're talking about this crisis of degree that's taken place in our culture really is a result of Christian men abdicating their responsibilities all over the map. So you read that first and foremost there. But I love that you added application, because it's true. I mean, a wife at home who is ruled by her passions, who is drunk on her passions or drunk on her children's passions, is an absolutely destructive force in the home. That's the woman in Proverbs who tears her house down with her own hands, kind of thing, right? So that's really, really good application. So one of the things that, just in kind of closing, that this has been, and I honestly, I want to tell you that there are certain things. I remember John Piper saying one time that sermons don't change people's lives, sentences do, books don't, but phrases do.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, the God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in Him was one of my big, and I know that was really influential for you, but. One of the things that has been that way for me since sort of getting reacquainted with your ministry is first in, last out, laughing loudest. That's just totally, it's been helpful for me just as I disciple men in my church. It's been so helpful for me as I clock out of one job and into the next, coming into my home and putting on dad hat and all that stuff. So I just kind of want you to wrap some of our themes up together by telling us about King Loon and how that principle applies.
Yeah. So first in, last out, laughing loudest is my riff on a quote from The Horse and His Boy, where King Loon describes what it means to be a king. It means to be first in every desperate attack, last in every desperate retreat. And when there's hunger in the land, as must be now and again in bad years, to wear finer clothes and laugh louder at a scantier meal than any man in your land. And so the idea is, so he says that's what kingship is. And so then I want to say, okay, that's what headship is. That's what masculinity is. That's what we're focused on. And so first in is there's a disposition to sacrifice, right? Well, I'm going to take the hit. Whenever there's a burden to be borne as the leader, I'm going to bear it first. I'm going to be first through the door. So whatever, pick your metaphor. The idea is that it's not that your wife say doesn't sacrifice, or that your people say, if you're a pastor, don't sacrifice. It's that when they sacrifice, they're following you. They're following you. And their sacrifices might look different than yours because of the different station that you're in. You may have you're sacrificing this and they're sacrificing that, but you're doing it first and they're doing it second. So first in, and then last out means that burden that needs to be borne, you're going to bear it the longest, right? You're not going to check out early. You're going to lean in with all the way down, okay? So first in, last out really gets to that sacrificial dimension. And then it's the laughing loudest that I think really does it accents the sober-mindedness, the governance of the passion. So external circumstances are against you. There's hunger in the land. It's not a happy Christmas because there's no food on the table. It's a scanty meal. And yet, what's the disposition of the leader? He's at the head of the table, laughing loudest. He's leading the way and saying, isn't God kind? Isn't he give thanks for the food that you have, not for the food that you don't have? And so not grumbling about the food you lack. And so there's the laughing loudest is really key. So that the sacrifice as the head, the leaning in, the bearing the burden, that's important. But it's that there's gravity and there's gladness. There's both. And so that's the picture of manhood that I try to, I've been preaching it to myself for a long time and trying to live it out in my own home and in the different spheres I operate, and want other men to do the same as a way, because this is ultimately, it's the model. It's what Christ did. So Jesus is the one who was the first in, last out, and did it for the joy set before him. He was, I'm going to get the kingdom. I'm going to get those people. It's going to be hard. It's going to be painful. He'll weep tears, shed tears of blood in the garden. He's anxious. He's disturbed. This is not what he wants in itself. And yet he's got the bigger picture in view. He knows what this is for. He's got a purpose. And so he's going to go through with it for the joy set before him, and then bring us all, many sons, to glory.
Amen. That's awesome. And I guess as all of our people are listening to that, I would say you capture that vision, and then go back to what Joe said, you said earlier, where it's, the gospel changes people, God transforms people, and changed people change the world around them. And so how this works its way into the world is when you are faithful with what you're given, you become a self-ruled man, a sober-minded man, ruled by the Spirit of God, who is first in, last out, laughing loudest. You begin to change your family or those around you. your family begins to affect their community, whether that's your church community or whatever. Church communities begin to change the neighborhoods around them and the cities in which they dwell, and change cities begin to change the world. And I think that that's what, I will say there's sort of this resurgence of post-millennial optimism in the world around us. And I think there's all kinds of these debates, top down, bottom up, all that kind of stuff. But I say if every Christian is committed to that vision, be the first in, the last out, laughing loudest, where God has placed you, and do not despise the day of small things, then when we're all standing looking back at the kingdom in 50-year increments, we'll see that trajectory. And however it is that God blesses our efforts, the kingdom of God will be built around us.
That's right. Yeah. And this is exactly right. It's a good example, even back of the triage thing we were talking about. You being united on the common duty, the common responsibility that we have. This is what we should do. And some people may say, because of the way they read scriptures, and it'll be really successful and fruitful in this age. And others say, it'll be middling. Maybe it won't. Okay, we'll leave the results in God's hands. We'll all be content to just leave the results to God. But what are we supposed to do? What's the call? We can at least we can have that union around that.
That's right. And we can see the normal pattern of the scriptures is that God changes people who change the world around them. And however, as you said, however far that change goes, however, glad God is to see that done in our midst, praise God. But the duty set before us, we take it with gladness and joy. Amen. Where can people continue to follow you, get your books, all that kind of stuff? Where would you direct people if this is their first introduction to you and they want to hear more?
Yeah, so the only social media I'm on is Joe_Rigney on Twitter. So you can find me there. Beyond that, I've a lot of old stuff at Desiring God, a lot of articles at Desiring God. A lot of newer stuff is at Canon Plus. And so you can get the new books at emotionalsabotage.com, so you can pick that one up there. But those are kind of the smattering of places that you can find me around.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for your time, Joe. I will be praying for the continued favor in all the work that you're doing, and thanks for all of it.
All right. Thanks, Nate. Appreciate it.